him and running the government while he recovers. The Foreign Secretary and First Secretary of State, Dominic Raab. Welcome, Mr. Raab.
Good morning.
A grim moment, 20,000 deaths, but it's a lot more than that, isn't it?
Oh, it's heartbreaking to pass that threshold. Grim overall, but also you think of all the loved ones left behind, and that, one success though we have had, if you look at the measures we've taken, the timing of them, is that we are starting to see the flattening of the peak. So it sounds difficult to say, but that death toll could have been much worse if we hadn't have taken the social distancing measures, and crucially if the public hadn't have really backed them in the way they did. And secondly, we've kept our critical care capacity in the NHS. We've preserved it with the V beds, the ventilator beds, the critical care beds, and that has also meant that as we go through the peak, the NHS has been able to cope not just with coronavirus patients, but other urgent treatments too.
I'm just sticking with the numbers for a moment, though. It looks as if the 20,000 figure, which is for deaths in hospital, there's about the same number of deaths out of hospital in the community and in care homes and elsewhere. Is that, roughly speaking, what you think?
Well, we don't know for sure. We've always said that it's more difficult outside of hospitals to measure because in care homes you've got lots of elderly people, sometimes with multiple conditions. So what we've done and what the Care Quality Commission is doing with the ONS is looking very carefully at the figures, and they'll release some more later this week. But we've always been clear that the data we publish on NHS hospitals is because it is more reliable. It's also easier to compare internationally.
All right. Now, many of those who've died have, of course, been NHS and care workers themselves. Do they deserve the best protection?
Absolutely, and every one of them. We've seen 78, I think, on the latest figures, NHS staff pass away as a result of this, 16 care workers, and that's why we know there's been a challenge with personal protective equipment. We're doing everything we can in an international supply shortage to get them the PPE, the equipment that they need. But it hasn't been easy. We hold our hands up. It hasn't been easy for any country.
Have they had the best kit?
The very best we can get them. As Foreign
That's
Secretary...
no, isn't it?
No.
They haven't had the best kit, have they?
They've had... Well, in terms of the actual kit that they're distributed with, that depends on NHS leaders and the Chief Medical Officer and Public Health England giving the guidance. That's not done by politicians. But when I speak to foreign ministers and foreign leaders, which I do every day, every country has this challenge. So what we've done, we've delivered 1 billion items of PPE equipment to care homes, to the NHS, elsewhere where it's needed. We've ramped up the domestic supply and procurement with Paul Dayton, who ran the 2012 Olympics, coming in really to put his shoulder to the wheel and grip that. And on the international side of things, from China to the US, everyone, we are making sure we're the international buyer of choice so that where there are opportunities, notwithstanding a massive global shortage, we can secure that PPE and get it to the front line as soon as possible.
You mentioned Public Health England just now, but they said, new guidance they put out on the 17th of this month said some compromise is needed to optimise the supply of PPE in times of shortage. Now, those people applauding the NHS workers don't want compromises to be taken in protective equipment.
Well, those kind of guidance changes and making sure that the resources and the equipment we get to those in the right level of prioritisation is something that the NHS is used to doing, and they are within the WHO guidelines. So nothing has been done which is irresponsible, and quite rightly, Public Health England and the NHS leaders take those decisions.
You say that, but at the same time, we've got lots of reports of NHS people having to reuse gowns, wash and reuse gowns, and indeed nurses. The Federation of Nurses has reported that nurses are being given cagoules instead of gowns. There is still a lot of anxiety on the front line about PPE, even after all of this effort.
Absolutely. And look, I'm going to be honest with you, this has been a challenge. We've got a lot of things right, the social distancing measures, the critical care capacity, but countries around the world have faced this global supply shortage. So the reassurance I can give is not just that we have delivered huge numbers of protective equipment, but there is no stone being left unturned in relation to either domestic production or supply or the international supply. We are the international buyer of PPE of choice for anyone that can, at the right specification, because as you said, the safety of the equipment is important, but also at the scale to get it to the front line where it's needed.
So by when will enough PPE have arrived so that no compromises need to be made in hospitals and in care homes?
Well, it's very difficult to say that with precision and the kind of reliability that you want as a guarantee. What I can say is we're making sure that we've got as much stocks, and also when we've got stocks of PPE, and sometimes we, in certain regions or in certain areas like NHS versus care homes, that we can move it to where it's most needed. The agility of the system as well as the overall supply is critically important. We're doing everything we can on that front.
There's still something going wrong at the sort of centre when it comes to this. There's a company called Ecologic on Merseyside which offered 10 million masks to the Cabinet Office, and then more than a week passed without any kind of answer at all, and they eventually gave up and they sold the masks abroad. And they're not the only company who have found difficulty getting through and getting responses to genuine offers of the essential kit. So something's going wrong at the centre.
Well, look, there's certainly been a huge number of companies offering their services and their supplies, and that's great. We want that. Every one of them should be getting a response, but then, of course, we whittle them down to the ones that can provide the NHS equipment at the specification, and also the volume that makes it worth proceeding. I know the NHS is looking at well over 1,000 of those suppliers that have come forward. Can I just make one point, though? We have seen countries, and I'm not going to single them out, but European countries who have distributed PPE where it's not at the right specification. Then they've had to not just withdraw it, but the NHS workers in their countries, or the health workers in their country, have had to go into isolation. So it is really important, and I know it may feel bureaucratic for some companies, that we do the checks.
Yeah.
So we're trying to get
but
as
with
swiftly...
respect, if you end up with cagoules instead, it's not very effective. I mean, I'm not trying to be silly about this. You've got lots of things right as a government. Clearly, the Nightingale, the ventilator story, in many respects, you've got right. Lots of things have gone well. But would you accept that perhaps PPE has not gone well?
Well, I think we're not in the place on PPE that we'd want to be, but I guess the point I'd make is that there's an international supply shortage, and you're dealing with an unprecedented and very deadly virus, and people weren't clear at the outset quite what the full implications all the way down the track would be. Everyone is grappling with this issue. What I can tell you is no country is putting more effort in to making sure people on the front line have got the equipment that they need.
Let's try and sit back and look ahead a little bit if we can.
Sure.
Life is not going to return to normal, is it, anytime soon?
I think we won't just have this binary easing up of measures, if that's what you're talking about. We'll end up moving to, and I heard Nicola Sturgeon use the same language I've used before about moving to a new normal. And I think we will need to make sure that we can proceed in a sure-footed way, which is why I know the temptation to start announcing proposals now, but actually until you've got the evidence, that's not responsible. It risks you ending up misleading. I know you're not going down, but we need to take a sure-footed step forward, which protects life, but also preserves our way of life. So we're very focused on doing the homework that can allow us to do that. But you're absolutely right. For example, the social distancing measures, applying them in different contexts is going to be with us for some time.
So when people are sitting at home and trying to sort of guess or imagine what's coming next, how different is the new normal going to be, as it were, compared to the world in early March that we left behind?
Well, I think it's going to be different in lots of the ways that we're already seeing. So, for example, I went and got on Friday night some milk from the supermarket. Everyone is queuing 2 metres apart. There are all sorts of precautions the businesses have taken. If you think that those are the measures that we've taken for essential businesses that haven't shut down, you can see how in various different ways they could be expanded to non-essential businesses currently closed in other contexts. But it is going to be important that we've got some social distancing measures going forward in all of these areas. And also, if you think about what employers and in those businesses are doing with hand gel, cleaning surfaces and all of those other measures.
Perhaps fewer people in the office near each other, perhaps fewer people sharing screens and mouses and keyboards and pens and coffee cups and all of that.
All of those variables will be important, but you can immediately see why. First of all, as we said when we set out our 5 tests, we need to get the virus down in terms of the death rate and the infection rate. We also need to test what is the responsible thing to do, what doesn't allow the virus to come back, take grip and lead to a second spike. Not only, can I just make the final point, not only would that be bad for our health as a country and the death toll, but also, as the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey has said, would be bad for the economy. You'd get a protracted lockdown, a second lockdown, and that would damage public confidence. So as I say, there'll be a new normal. Plenty of the things you've described will be part of it, but we do need to make sure the next step we take is a sure-footed one.
Again, not looking for new policy, but just for your reflections. Is it possible for schools to come back without social distancing?
I think it's inconceivable that they would come back without further measures as are already being applied in those schools that are open for key workers, and looking at how that could be done. I'm not going to get drawn on this.
I'm not, but that means, logically, because the schools can't double in size overnight, that the class sizes are going to have to be smaller.
I understand what you're trying to do.
Well, I'm not trying to do anything. I'm just trying to imagine, which means that kids will not go to school every day, or they might go to school for only part of the day. Again, lots of parents and children and teachers are just trying to imagine the kind of options the government will eventually have to make and announce.
But you see, if I start suggesting one or other thing now without us knowing where the virus is and without us testing the package of measures with the scientists, which is the homework that we're doing, we send the wrong signals and we don't provide reassurance. We actually might provide more worry for parents and teachers. But you're certainly right to say, and of course, with schools, as with essential
kind of choices that you're having to talk about inside government and eventually announce, you're going to have to do something like that.
Well, the most important thing is to look at the extent to which schools would be a vehicle for allowing the virus to spread. We know that among children and younger people, it is much less likely to have a dangerous impact on them, but children as a means for spreading the virus between households is something where we need the scientists to give us further evidence. So we'll look at all of those measures, but I'm not going to be drawn on the detail because we might end up changing our mind once we know the fuller evidence.
You might. And again, I'm not asking you for the detail, but there's been reports that, and people are talking about this up and down the country, that we will be allowed 10 friends and family with whom we can socially intercourse, as it were. Is that the kind of thing that the government's thinking about?
Well, I've heard all of those kinds of things. And of course...
That was briefed by the government, by somebody in the government.
And I hear all sorts of things that are apparently briefed by the government, which turn out not to be the case from the meetings that I'm attending. We will look at everything, from businesses and the schools that you've mentioned, where we've got some learning, because we've got social distancing measures in place for essential businesses and for those schools where key workers are still going, right the way through to the open spaces and the wider social interaction. But critically, we've got to make sure two things. First of all, we don't risk a second spike for all the reasons we've discussed. Secondly, that overall this package doesn't allow the coronavirus to get back hold, to spread more widely, and to undo all the progress we've made, and frankly, all the sacrifices so many people have made.
You're a sportsman. There's been a lot of talk about elite sport and football clubs playing games, you know, behind closed doors, as it were, for TV audiences. But again, up and down the country, there are huge numbers of smaller sporting clubs, cricket clubs, local football clubs, tennis clubs, wondering whether there's any chance of sport being played outside in this country during the summer.
Very difficult because of the level and the scale of interaction. I think the professional sport may be different because of the scale of testing that they would be able to introduce, but we will look at that in the round. One thing that is true to say, I think with the lockdown, it's not just been a strain on people physically, economically. I think there is a lot of mental health challenges with that, and anyone with small children will know that. So we do want to look, when it's safe, when it's responsible, at ways to allow more outdoors activities to take place. But again, we've got to have the evidence that that is a sure-footed step and doesn't allow coronavirus to get a grip back on the country.
Sure. And to stop that happening, you mentioned testing just now, but to stop that happening, clearly everyone's watching this 100,000 tests a day target, but it's beyond that, isn't it? Let me read you Matt Hancock on the 3rd of April. We increased the goal for the end of April to 100,000 tests, and then we will go on to meet the target which the Prime Minister has previously set out of 250,000 tests per day. Is that 250,000 tests per day target still the government's aim?
Well, certainly we want to get 100,000 daily tests by the end of the month. We're on track. I can talk about the detail with you of that. But you're absolutely right. That is a milestone. We've got to ramp testing right up. And I don't know whether it was set out as a specific target. I think it is more...
The Prime Minister said that you were going to do it.
Well, we certainly got to get the daily testing right up to hundreds of thousands, which along with the the tracking and the tracing gives us a chance to... What it does, and what's really important about this, gives us more flexibility. Because we can open up measures, open up access in the way you've described, but monitor very carefully the effects. And that, along with the vaccine and therapeutics, will be the medium and long-term way of dealing with coronavirus sustainably, responsibly, for good.
To track this virus, we have to start to test people without symptoms. When are we going to do that?
So again,
to test people without symptoms. When are we going to be able to test people without symptoms in order to track the virus?
Well, we can test people now with the swab test, but what matters is, of course, look, the changes that we've made at the tail end of last week were really important. We focused our testing capacity on NHS workers. We broadened it to care home workers. Then obviously, I think people understand the immediate priority. Then last week, we've expanded it to all essential workers. And that is, I think, the right set of priorities immediately. But of course, when you look at things like the social distancing measures, the 7 and the 14-day rules, once we've got testing up to the kind of scale, we can look and see whether people are in the households who are in isolation but actually haven't got the virus, whether actually they can go back to work more quickly.
Yes,
but you need to get the testing right up there for that.
There were reports in the papers today about a big breakthrough on the antibody tests and suggestions that the government had already ordered 30 million of those. Is that right?
Well, I'm not sure whether we've ordered those. We're certainly looking very carefully at that. The antibody tests, of course, for viewers at home, will make sure that they test for whether someone has previously had the virus. And there's
therefore possibly immune.
Possibly immune. But let's just be clear about this. You've talked about testing and vaccines, really important. And we're pursuing each of those at pace and at scale to make sure that we can deal medium and long term. But the vaccine wouldn't realistically come into play until the end of the year. The testing, tracking and tracing, I think, has a better medium-term prognosis. There's also therapeutics and drugs. And the reason that's important is if we can actually treat coronavirus and take away the fatalities, if it became something more akin to seasonal flu, that would also give us more flexibility in the next transition phase.
But there has been a breakthrough on the antibodies, as far as you're aware.
Well, there's all sorts of progress that's been made. I think we need to make sure in the NHS that it's reliable. I don't think that we're yet sure we've got an antibody test that can be scaled up, which can be safely relied on.
Just looking back, for absolutely obvious and good reasons to protect the NHS, we sent people out of hospitals back into care homes before they were tested. And by doing that, we may have sent the virus straight into the heart of the most vulnerable communities in the country. Do you look back and think that may have been a serious mistake?
I think we're learning lessons all the time, but you're right to say that in the social care plan, the action plan Matt Hancock put out, it's very clear that people have to not just be tested before they're discharged from hospital to go into care homes, but we've revised the guidance so that within care homes, where you have non-COVID residents, but also COVID, people suffering from COVID-19, that the right arrangements are in place.
We only started testing people going back into care homes, I think, about 10 days ago, and it's beginning to look as if what's going on in care homes might be the darkest part of this whole story.
Well, I'm not sure that I'd say it's the darkest, but we've said all along that there is particular vulnerability in care homes. The reason being is you've got large numbers of people over 65 with multiple conditions, and we're waiting for the CQC and the ONS to give us a better handle on the number. But we're also reasonably confident that the deaths in care homes is coming down at about the similar rate to more broadly as captured by the NHS figures. And critically, whether it's the testing, the PPE, the ramping up of the workforce to 20,000. Again, it's not. You sort of suggested that we're kind of not doing enough in those areas. We're doing everything that we reasonably can. The military helping to distribute the tests.
I know hindsight's a wonderful thing and all of that. It's just that there does seem to be a particular problem with taking people with COVID-19 and putting them into care homes and the result of that. But can I ask about something slightly different? There's been a lot of criticism of the government for not testing people and stopping them as they're coming into the country through airports in particular. Is that going to change?
Well, it might do, but I can't say with any certainty yet. The reason being, the advice that we got, and I checked it with the scientist, the chief medical officer, at the outset when we took our social distancing measures, is it wouldn't make any difference from a public health point of view. The numbers coming down were of people travelling were plummeting, and also the virus was already at pace.
There might be a quarantine period put in for people coming into the country.
Well, whether it's a quarantine period or testing or other measures that might be taken, it's possible. And I ask this question every week. Can we just check that there aren't measures at the border that at the current level of the coronavirus challenge that we face wouldn't make a difference? And we will keep asking that question.
Gloucestershire Live looked at a survey of the hospitals in that area and found the hospital nearest to the Cheltenham racecourse had the highest number of COVID-19 deaths, given how many people were at these mass gatherings at the Cheltenham races. Looking back, again, do you think it was a mistake not to stop those mass gatherings a bit earlier?
Well, we took the scientific advice available to us at the time, and we balanced that very carefully in the round. But look, Andrew, we're learning lessons as we go through this. Every country is, but also I come back to that point. One, you mentioned the successes the government have had, flattening the peak, making sure the NHS is able to cope. That only happened because we've very deliberately taken the right measures at the right moment in time. So that basic approach, I'm sure and confident looking back, is the right one.
An entirely different story. Is Kim Jong-un dead?
We don't know. I've read the media reports internationally. We haven't got that corroborated yet, but obviously we're following it very carefully.
Boris Johnson is coming back tomorrow. I gather he's in good form. You've been spending quite a lot of time talking to him and meeting him. Yes. Did you enjoy this period running the country? Enjoy is perhaps the wrong word. Did you have some relish to actually be in charge for a while, or are you just simply relieved to be handing it back?
I don't think any of those really does it justice. I mean, look, when your Prime Minister is stricken with the coronavirus, and particularly when we knew it was touch and go, you're thinking very much personally of him, but also the role of leading the government. I also think of the country and the position it's in. And like all of those key workers, like the rest of the country, my job is just to step up to the plate. And I have to say...
And he's going to come back in full force, is he?
Yeah, I was just going to say the whole cabinet and the civil service have really stepped up to the plate, because it has been a difficult time. The PM is looking forward to getting back. He's raring to go. I think it will give a boost to the government and a boost to the country.
Dominic Raab, thanks very much indeed for coming in to talk to us this morning. That's all from me. Thanks to all my guests, and above all to you for watching. There's more politics on BBC One after this programme. I will be back, of course, next week.